On the first night, she whispered something he would never forget. "Please be gentle." That plea hid a secret that would transform a simple promise into something far deeper, something neither of them could have imagined in that moment. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the ending will move you in a way you don't expect. Willa trembled when Sterling opened the door to the presidential suite at the Fairmont in San Francisco, not from fear, but from the consciousness of the weight of that moment that would seal her destiny. The white dress she had chosen with such care seemed to suffocate her shoulders as he observed her with those gray eyes that had already commanded boardrooms filled with powerful men. And then, with a voice that could barely escape her tight throat, she said the words that no woman had dared say to him before. "Please, be gentle." The businessman, accustomed to having everything his way, to conquering and dominating every aspect of his meticulously planned life, felt something strange pierce his chest, a mixture of surprise and something he hadn't experienced in decades. Genuine respect. The marriage had been arranged by circumstances she never imagined facing. Her family, once prosperous in the wine region of Finger Lakes in upstate New York, had lost everything when late frosts and blights destroyed 3 consecutive harvests of Riesling. The sweet perfume of ripe grapes that used to fill her childhood in the fields between Geneva and Hammondsport gave way to the smell of worry and debt papers accumulated on the kitchen table. She, the eldest daughter, grew up watching her father's hair turn prematurely white, hearing the whispered arguments after dinner of pot roast and potatoes, tasting the bitter flavor of helplessness in each increasingly simple meal. When the proposal came through an elegant intermediary from Manhattan, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the family vineyard's mortgage, she knew she had only one real choice. Sterling was known on 3 continents. His businesses extended across sectors she barely understood. Technology, commercial real estate in New York and San Francisco, investments that moved fortunes while ordinary people slept. He was 42 years old, 15 years older than her, and had a reputation that made even experienced men lower their gaze. They said he was ruthless in negotiations, cold in decisions, and had already gone through 2 marriages that ended in silent agreements and generous compensations. But she also noticed something the business journals never mentioned: the way his fingers drummed discreetly on the table during tense meetings, a subtle sign of humanity hidden beneath layers of corporate armor. In the first months of union, they inhabited the same space like polite strangers. The house where they came to live was an imposing structure of glass and steel, perched on the cliffs of Big Sur on the California coast. The constant sound of Pacific waves breaking against the rocks created a melancholic soundtrack for their carefully choreographed days. She woke to the aroma of coffee being prepared by the kitchen staff, ate breakfast alone on the terrace overlooking the ocean while he was already in video conferences with Tokyo or London, and spent afternoons exploring the gardens of native wildflowers and coastal redwoods meticulously maintained, or the library with thousands of volumes that no one else seemed to touch. The first turning point came when she discovered, while exploring a closed wing of the house, a Steinway grand piano covered by a burgundy velvet cloth. The keys were dusty, but the instrument was perfectly tuned. When she pressed a note, the crystalline sound echoed through the wide corridor, and she didn't notice that Sterling was standing in the doorway, watching. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice carrying a texture she had never heard before. She used to say that music was the only language that didn't lie. That afternoon, he confessed that he had grown up surrounded by jazz melodies and classical music, that his mother, a frustrated pianist from Boston who gave up her career to marry a businessman from Connecticut, filled his childhood with Gershwin and Chopin before suddenly abandoning them when he was only 12 years old, leaving only a letter explaining that she could no longer live in that gilded cage. Willa began to play every afternoon, and Sterling began to appear, first only for a few minutes, then staying for the entire session, working on his laptop while the melodies filled the space between them. Music became their first shared language, a delicate bridge over the abyss of their differences. But the real challenge arose when her family faced a new crisis. The land in Finger Lakes, even with the debts settled by the marriage agreement, was too infertile to start over. Her father, Emerson, a man of silent pride typical of upstate farmers, fell ill with worry, and she found herself divided between her new world of California privileges and the roots that formed her among vineyards and century-old wineries. It was during this period, approximately 5 months after the wedding, that a second transformation occurred. He arrived home earlier than normal and found her crying silently in the garden of native lupines, holding her phone. "My father can't hold a wine glass anymore," she said, her voice broken. "His hands shake so much with anxiety that he spills everything." She expected discomfort, perhaps a quick suggestion to hire medical help. Instead, Sterling sat beside her on the teak bench, his $10,000 Italian suit wrinkling without him seeming to care, and said, "Tell me about him. What he was like before all this." They talked until the sky darkened over the Pacific, and for the first time she saw cracks in the impenetrable facade. He spoke about his own father, Harrison, a Connecticut businessman who measured love in spreadsheets and success in numbers, who never approved of anything beyond measurable achievements. "I became everything he wanted," he admitted, looking at the sea that merged with the darkened horizon. "And in the process, I forgot how to be anything else." The scent of wild sage from nearby plants mixed with the salty Pacific air, creating a fragrance she would always associate with the moment she began to see the man behind the empire. The third change came unexpectedly. He hired agricultural specialists from Cornell University, not just ordinary consultants, but researchers specialized in recovering historic vineyards and organic viticulture techniques. Without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude, he invested in a long-term project to revitalize the Ashford family lands in Finger Lakes. When she discovered this, through an emotional call from her mother, Margaret, she confronted him in the office overlooking the sea. "Why did you do this?" she asked, confused by generosity that wasn't part of any contract. He looked over his reading glasses, and for the first time, she saw a genuine smile cross his face. "Because you asked for gentleness that first night, and I realized I had never been gentle a single day in my life. You showed me that there's power in kindness." The following months brought a series of intertwined discoveries and challenges. Their social life began to expand, and Willa was gradually introduced to the world of charity galas at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, corporate dinners in San Francisco, and events in the Hamptons, where every word was measured and every gesture analyzed. She was naturally reserved, preferring deep conversations with few people to small talk with crowds. But she developed an unexpected skill. She could read people with disturbing precision. At a crucial dinner with Asian investors at the French Laundry in Napa Valley, she noticed subtle signs: the way a potential partner avoided direct eye contact when discussing contractual terms, how his hands moved nervously when mentioning deadlines, and discreetly alerted Sterling in hushed English. Her intuition saved him from a fraudulent deal that would have cost millions. This revelation brought a fourth transformation. He began to trust her, not just emotionally but professionally. Against all corporate protocols, he began to include her in strategic meetings at his office on Fifth Avenue. His advisors complained, some openly doubting the capacity of a young woman from upstate New York, without business training to contribute. But she proved her worth repeatedly, not with technical knowledge, but with an innate understanding of human motivations and social dynamics that the experienced businessmen from Manhattan frequently overlooked. The first major turning point came approximately 8 months after the wedding. A routine audit revealed that his chief financial officer, Garrett, a man from Boston, who had been his right hand for 15 years, was systematically diverting funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The discovery didn't come through professional auditors, but through Willa. She had noticed subtle inconsistencies in casual reports, patterns that didn't align with declared expenses for expansion in the South and Midwest, and had the courage to question. The blow of betrayal was devastating to Sterling, not just financially but emotionally. "I trusted him with my life," he said that night, sitting on the office floor, surrounded by papers, his impeccable appearance finally crumbling. She sat beside him, not offering empty words of comfort, just her silent presence and a firm hand on his shoulder. It was in that moment of shared vulnerability that something fundamental changed between them. The marriage, which had begun as a cold transaction executed through Manhattan lawyers, was transforming into a genuine partnership. But with this closeness came new fears. Willa began to question her own feelings. Was she really falling in love, or was it disguised gratitude? His past began to emerge in fragments. She discovered through a conversation with his veteran assistant Darlene, a woman from Philadelphia who had worked with him for decades, that his ex-wives hadn't left because of his cruelty, but because of his inability to connect emotionally. He always treated relationships like business contracts, the older woman explained, while they had coffee at a cafe overlooking Central Park. He never learned that love isn't negotiated like office towers. But with Willa, something was different. He was trying, awkwardly sometimes, stumbling into vulnerability like someone learning a new language. The second major turning point came during the Finger Lakes Wine Festival in Geneva, the harvest festival in the region where she grew up. Sterling had insisted on attending, something his advisors considered beneath his status, but he wanted to understand where she came from, to walk the streets that shaped her childhood. During the celebration, where the sound of folk music filled squares decorated with grape clusters and wine barrels, where the smell of grilled bratwurst and grape pie saturated the autumn air of upstate New York, he was recognized, not as the distant magnate from New York City, but as the man who was saving local family wineries through his investments in agricultural technology and wine tourism. People, including Emerson, approached with genuine gratitude. Willa saw tears in her father's eyes, a man who rarely showed emotion according to the reserved custom of upstate men, when he shook Sterling's hand and said, "You gave us back our dignity." But what she didn't expect was to see tears in his eyes too. There, surrounded by vintners and vineyard workers who treated him as human and not as empire, he experienced something he had lost decades ago in the glass towers of Manhattan: belonging. That night, back at the house in Big Sur, they finally talked about the elephant that had always inhabited the room. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice unusually hesitant. Having accepted this arrangement, she considered the question carefully, savoring the Riesling they had brought from the festival, the earthy taste of oak reminding her of roots and growth. "I regret," she said finally, seeing pain cross his face before completing, "not also asking you to be honest, you to be about your fears, your dreams, about who you really are without the corporate thrones of Fifth Avenue. Truth hurts less than prolonged lies, even when it stings in the moment." This brutal honesty opened floodgates. They spent the entire night talking on the terrace, revealing layers they had carefully kept hidden, while the distant sound of the Pacific accompanied their confessions. He confessed his terror of not being enough outside of business, that without his empire built between New York and San Francisco, there was nothing of value in him. She admitted her fear of losing herself in that world of California luxury, of forgetting the girl who ran barefoot among the upstate vineyards, of becoming just a pretty accessory at glittering events on the Manhattan social circuit. "I don't want you to be gentle all the time," she said eventually, her voice firm. "I want you to be real." The third major turning point came from a completely unexpected direction. His ex-wife, the first one, a woman from an old Philadelphia family, reappeared after years of silence. Not with financial demands or scandals, but with a revelation that shook the foundations. Sterling had a teenage daughter, Cora, whom he never knew existed. The young woman, now 15 years old, was sick, needing an urgent transplant, and the mother, after years of pride typical of old Philadelphia families, was asking for help. The news came through a handwritten letter that Willa intercepted, addressed to him but sent to an old office in Boston. She faced an impossible decision: deliver the letter and potentially destroy the fragile trust they had built, or hide it and live with the weight of a secret that could save a life. For 3 agonizing days, the letter burned in her drawer like embers. She could barely sleep, the moral dilemma gnawing at her conscience as she watched the sea through the window. Finally, during a breakfast where the California sun came through the windows, creating patterns of light on the marble floor, she placed the letter beside his coffee cup. "This came for you," she said simply. "And regardless of what you decide, I'll be here." The discovery of a secret daughter could have destroyed more solid marriages, but for them, it became a test that neither expected. Sterling was in shock for days, alternating between anger directed at his ex-wife for hiding the child and anger directed at himself for not having insisted on maintaining contact after the bitter divorce. But what surprised him was Willa's reaction. She wanted to help, not out of marital obligation or social appearances, but because she genuinely cared about his pain and the fate of an innocent girl who grew up between Philadelphia and New York. "Her name is Cora," he said, his voice breaking as he read the letter for the 10th time. "She's 15 years old, she's sick, and Vivian, my ex, is asking me to take the compatibility tests for a bone marrow transplant. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It returns to reclaim the present." The following months were a whirlwind of medical tests at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, consultations with international specialists, and the delicate task of meeting Cora, a young woman who had grown up hating the father who abandoned her. The daughter, rebellious and wounded, didn't make anything easy. She rejected his initial attempts at connection with the sharp disdain that only American teenagers can execute perfectly. "You think you can buy my forgiveness like you buy everything?" she yelled during a particularly difficult encounter at the New York hospital. "Where were you when I needed a father to teach me to ride a bike in Central Park? When my mum worked 3 jobs? It was Willa, the unlikely stepmother, who managed to create the first bridge. She didn't try to act as mother or friend. Instead, she simply showed up, sat in the hospital room, and played soft music on a portable keyboard she had brought. Not just classical pieces, but also folk melodies that her grandmother used to hum in Finger Lakes. She didn't talk much, just created a space of calm in the medical chaos. Gradually, Cora began to ask questions, first about music, then about the vineyards where Willa grew up, and eventually about the father she was slowly learning to know. The transplant was a success at New York Presbyterian Hospital, but the road to recovery was long and filled with complications. During the 6 months of intensive treatment, something unexpected happened. They became a family, strange and imperfect, but real. Sterling learned patience at the hospital bedside, holding Cora's hand during painful procedures, talking about the childhood she had and the one he lost. Willa discovered maternal strength she didn't know she possessed, defending the young woman against insensitive doctors and American hospital bureaucracy. And Cora slowly began to understand that complex people make terrible mistakes, but can also desperately try to do better. 1 year after that first night at the Fairmont, they found themselves again in the same presidential suite room. The circumstance was different, a private celebration marking not only their wedding anniversary, but Cora's complete recovery and the first profit from the revitalized lands in Finger Lakes, now producing an award-winning wine that was beginning to compete in international markets. Sterling pulled her gently, and she noticed how his movements had changed, how there was genuine softness where before there was only calculated control, typical of Manhattan businessmen. "That first night," he said, his voice loaded with emotion, "when you asked me to be gentle, I thought I understood. I thought you were just nervous, asking for physical consideration, but you were asking for something much bigger, weren't you?" Willa nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I was asking you to be human with me, to set aside the empire built between New York and San Francisco, the armor forged in the boardrooms of Fifth Avenue, just for a moment, and see that I wasn't a transaction, a solution to an upstate family's debts, or a convenience. I was a person, scared and hopeful, wanting to be seen." He pulled her into an embrace, and his scent, a mixture of American cedar and something indefinably him, was no longer intimidating, but familiar and comforting. "You taught me," he whispered against her hair, "that real power isn't in dominating like my father did from his office in Connecticut, but in trusting, in being vulnerable enough to let someone really in. True love isn't born ready. It's built, brick by brick, truth by truth." The promise of that first night in San Francisco had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. It wasn't a fairy tale where everything resolved perfectly. They still had arguments about his tendency to work late at the Fifth Avenue office. She still struggled with insecurities about her place in his world of Hamptons dinners and Manhattan meetings, and the relationship with Cora had moments of typical tension between stubborn New York teenagers and parental figures. But they built something solid on foundations that began fragile: mutual respect, painful honesty, and the daily courage to choose each other, not through contractual obligation executed by Manhattan lawyers, but through genuine love that grew like the vines on the revitalized lands of Finger Lakes, slowly, with care, but with deep roots that promised to withstand difficult seasons. Willa's integration into Sterling's corporate world began unexpectedly during a business trip to New York. He had important meetings with Japanese investors interested in a technology development project in the Hudson Yards. Normally, he would have traveled alone or with his advisors, leaving Willa at the Big Sur house. But this time, driven by something he didn't fully understand, he asked her to accompany him. "You don't have to attend the meetings," he clarified quickly, misinterpreting the surprise on her face. "I just thought, maybe you'd like to see the Statue of Liberty, walk through the Met. There's a beautiful hotel in Tribeca where—" "I'd like to go to the meetings," she interrupted, her voice firm but soft. He blinked, thrown off. "The meetings will be technical, boring. They'll talk about capital structures and return on investment projections. Still, I'd like to go, if you don't mind." And so Willa found herself sitting in an elegant conference room at the Four Seasons, watching her husband negotiate with Asian businessmen whose expressions remained carefully neutral. The meeting unfolded in English, with occasional translation, full of technical terms she didn't fully understand. But she understood people. She noticed how the lead investor, Mr. Tanaka, avoided direct eye contact when discussing timelines. She observed how his associates' hands moved nervously when mentioning specific financial commitments. She saw micro-expressions of doubt cross carefully composed faces when Sterling presented optimistic projections. Something didn't add up. During a break, while the others enjoyed coffee and bagels on the terrace overlooking Manhattan, Willa approached Sterling discreetly. "Do you trust them?" she asked in a low voice. He looked at her with surprise. "They're respected investors, with solid portfolios in Asia and North America. Why do you ask?" "Because they're not looking you in the eyes when they talk about long-term commitments." And Mr. Tanaka touched his tie exactly 4 times when they discussed payment schedules. "It's an unconscious gesture of anxiety." Sterling frowned, processing this information. His first reaction was to dismiss the observations as amateurish, the product of someone without experience in international negotiations. But something in her tone, in the quiet certainty of her observation, made him pause. Sometimes untrained eyes see what experts have learned to ignore. That night, he instructed his legal team to investigate the investors more deeply. What they discovered was revealing. The Japanese group was under scrutiny in their home country for questionable financial practices. The project they proposed was designed to transfer massive risks to American partners while they maintained control over valuable assets. The deal, which would have cost Sterling potentially millions in losses, was cancelled, and his perception of Willa changed fundamentally. "How did you know?" he asked that night in their hotel suite, Manhattan sparkling like a field of terrestrial stars through the panoramic windows. She shrugged, settling into the sofa with a glass of Finger Lakes Riesling in hand. "I grew up in a small world where words often hid truths, but bodies never lied. My father could say everything's fine, but his tense shoulders told another story. I learned to read what people don't say out loud." Against all his corporate instincts, against the advice of his veteran advisors who considered it inappropriate to involve his wife in business matters, Sterling began to include her in strategic meetings. Not as decoration or as a symbolic gesture of modernity, but because he genuinely valued her perspective. She never pretended to understand the technical complexities of real estate projects or cryptocurrency investments. But she contributed something that his team of MBAs and financial experts had lost in their years of corporate training: pure human intuition, the ability to read motivations and authenticity that no spreadsheet could capture. Sterling's advisors complained, some openly. Garrett, his Boston financial director who had been his right hand for 15 years, was particularly vocal. "It's inappropriate," he protested during a private meeting at the Fifth Avenue offices. "Clients will question our seriousness if we bring, with all due respect, a young woman from upstate New York without business training to strategic discussions." Sterling, who at another time would have accepted this argument without questioning it, surprised himself by defending his decision. "Willa saved me from losing $8 million in New York. How many times have you done that this quarter, Garrett?" The tense silence that followed marked a power shift that didn't go unnoticed in the executive team. The emperor of the corporate empire was changing, and not everyone was comfortable with the transformation. The first major rupture came like an earthquake that no one anticipated, not even Willa with her sharp intuition. A routine audit, conducted by an external team of accountants from Manhattan, revealed irregularities in the accounts of several expansion projects in the South and Midwest. The numbers didn't add up, There were suspicious transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands and patterns suggesting systematic fund diversion. The investigation led directly to Garrett Sullivan, the Boston financial director, who had been with Sterling from the beginning, who had helped build the empire from the first modest projects in Manhattan to the conglomerate that now spanned North America. Sterling received the report in his home office, with Willa present by chance organizing sheet music on the nearby piano. She saw how his face, tanned by the California sun, turned ashen as he read page after page of meticulously documented evidence. "It can't be," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Garrett has been with me for 15 years. I know him. I trust him with my life." But the numbers didn't lie. For almost 3 years, Garrett had been gradually diverting funds, amounts small enough in each transaction to go unnoticed individually, but totaling almost $20 million. He had been patient, methodical, and had taken advantage of the absolute trust Sterling placed in him. The pain of betrayal is proportional to the depth of the trust betrayed. The confrontation was devastating. Sterling summoned Garrett to the house, something unusual that immediately put the Bostonian on alert. When he presented the evidence, he expected vehement denials, protests of outraged innocence. Instead, Garrett simply collapsed. "I'm sorry," the older man said, tears running down his weathered cheeks. "My son has gambling problems, debts to dangerous people in Boston. I thought I could pay it back, that I just needed time. But the debts kept growing and I kept taking more and—" Sterling listened in silence, his expression like carved granite. When Garrett finished his broken confession, he spoke with a voice Willa had never heard, completely empty of emotion. "Get out of my house. The lawyers will be in touch." After Garrett left, discreetly escorted by security to avoid scenes, Sterling remained motionless in his office for hours. He didn't check emails or answer calls. He simply sat in his Italian leather chair, staring at the sea that no longer seemed to offer him any consolation. Willa watched him from the doorway, debating whether to approach or give space. Finally, seeing how his shoulders began to tremble almost imperceptibly, she made her decision. She entered silently and knelt beside his chair. "Sterling, I trusted him," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "Garrett was in my first miserable office in the Bowery, when I had more debts than assets. He was there when my second marriage fell apart, when my father died without saying a single word of pride to me. I considered him more than an employee. He was the closest thing to a friend I've had in decades." The tears finally came, silent but devastating, running down the face of a man who had built his entire life on absolute control. Willa didn't offer cheap words of comfort or try to minimize his pain. She simply stayed there, a solid presence in the midst of his collapse, her hand on his shoulder as he finally allowed decades of carefully constructed armor to crack. "Everyone betrays me eventually," he whispered eventually. "My mother abandoned me. My father used me as validation of his own worth. My wives saw me as an ATM. And now Garrett. The only logical conclusion is that it's me. There's something in me that inspires abandonment and betrayal." Willa waited until the tears subsided before speaking, choosing her words carefully. "Or maybe you've spent so much time building walls to protect yourself that only people willing to climb those walls illegally can get close. Maybe the problem isn't that you're unworthy of loyalty, but that you've made genuine loyalty almost impossible." He looked at her, eyes reddened but focused. "And you? Will you also climb my walls illegally eventually?" She held his gaze without blinking. "I don't need to climb your walls, Sterling. I'd like you to tear them down voluntarily, brick by brick when you're ready. Not to betray you, but to truly know you." That night marked a fundamental turning point. The blow of Garrett's betrayal could have pushed Sterling deeper into his shell of distrust and control, but instead, with Willa as witness to his most complete vulnerability, he began to understand something. The real risk wasn't trusting and being betrayed, but never trusting and dying emotionally long before his body stopped functioning. 3 weeks after the Garrett scandal, while Sterling was still rebuilding his executive team and dealing with the consequences of betrayal, something arrived that hit with even more devastating force. A handwritten letter, sent to an old office address in Boston, but forwarded by the diligent postal service. Willa intercepted it by chance. She had gone to collect business correspondence that occasionally still arrived at obsolete addresses of Sterling's empire. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper, no return address, with elegant feminine handwriting that simply wrote, "Sterling Thatcher Caldwell, personal and urgent." For 3 days, the letter burned in her desk drawer like hot coals. Willa knew she should deliver it immediately, that intercepting private correspondence was a violation of trust. But something about the elegance of that handwriting, the weight of the words personal and urgent, awakened a primitive anxiety she couldn't name. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the secret, she placed the letter beside Sterling's coffee cup during breakfast. The California sun created patterns of light on the terrace tiles, and the aroma of wild sage floated from the gardens, creating a beautiful incongruence with the tension she felt. "This came for you," she said simply, her voice tenser than she intended. "It was forwarded from your old office in Boston." He took the letter with a neutral expression, but she saw how his fingers tensed upon recognizing the handwriting. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he left it on the table, looking at it as if it were a snake about to strike. "Do you know who sent it?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I didn't open your correspondence," Willa responded, perhaps with excessive defensiveness, "but the handwriting seems feminine." Sterling nodded slowly, breathing deeply before opening the envelope with deliberate movements. As he read, Willa observed how the color drained from his face, how his hands began to tremble imperceptibly. When he finished, he left the letter on the table and stared into space, as if seeing ghosts only he could perceive. "It's from Vivian," he said eventually, his voice barely a whisper. "My first wife." Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, it returns to reclaim the present. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with 16 years of history Willa didn't know. She waited, her heart beating painfully, preparing for revelations she intuited would change everything. "I have a daughter," he continued, the words coming out with difficulty, as if each syllable physically hurt. "A 15-year-old daughter I never knew existed. Her name is Cora." The story emerged in painful fragments. Vivian, from an old Philadelphia family, had married Sterling when they were both young and ambitious in New York. The marriage was brief and volatile, ending in bitter divorce after only 2 years. She had returned to Philadelphia, and he had assumed that chapter was definitively closed. But Vivian had been pregnant when they separated, something she never told him. Out of pride, out of resentment, for complicated reasons she detailed in her letter, she had raised Cora alone for 15 years, keeping the child's existence as a jealously guarded secret. "And why now?" asked Willa, her voice colder than she intended. "Why reveal this after 15 years? Sterling lifted the letter with trembling hands. "Because Cora is sick. She needs a bone marrow transplant, and Vivian isn't compatible. The doctors said biological family members have the best chances of compatibility. So after years of pride and silence, she's asking for help." The cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Just when Sterling was beginning to trust again after Garrett's betrayal, the past returned with a complexity that defied all simple logic of victims and villains. Willa faced an impossible decision in that moment. She could react with justified anger at this massive secret that threatened their fragile marriage. She could demand explanations, accusations, guarantees, or she could choose something different, something that required a strength she wasn't sure she possessed. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally, her voice soft but firm. He looked at her with genuine surprise, as if expecting recriminations instead of this direct question. I don't know. I have a daughter I never knew, a teenager who probably hates me for abandoning her, even though I never knew she existed. And she's sick, potentially dying, and maybe I can help." Willa breathed deeply, searching within herself for reserves of compassion she didn't know she possessed. "Then we'll go to New York, we'll do the tests, and we'll meet your daughter." "We?" He blinked, confused. "We," she confirmed, extending her hand across the table. "Because this is what being truly married means, isn't it? Not just sharing the easy moments of California luxury and beautiful sunsets, but also facing complicated pasts and impossible decisions. Together." Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York became their second home during the following weeks. Cora had been transferred from Philadelphia to the hematology specialists in Manhattan, considered among the best in America. The first time Willa saw the girl, her heart broke in unexpected ways. Cora was small for her 15 years, with dark hair falling straight around a pale face that had undoubtedly been beautiful before illness robbed her vitality. She had the same grey eyes as Sterling, but where his were calculating and controlled, hers burned with adolescent rage magnified by pain and betrayal. "So you're the famous father," were her first words when Sterling entered her private room, sarcasm dripping from every syllable pronounced with a Philadelphia accent. The tycoon who was too busy building his empire to know he had a daughter. Sterling stopped as if physically struck. Willa, standing discreetly in the doorway, saw how he struggled to find words, any words, that could bridge 15 years of absence. Your mother never told me," he began awkwardly. "Oh, so it's my mother's fault," Cora exploded, her voice rising dangerously. "Of course, all men always blame women. Do you know how many times I saw her cry? How many times she worked 3 jobs so I could have ballet classes in Philadelphia? Where were you when I needed a father to teach me to ride a bike in Rittenhouse Square? When kids at school made fun of me for not having a dad? The pain of an abandoned child knows no logic or nuance. It only knows absence." The words fell like stones, each hitting with precision, intended to wound. Sterling didn't try to defend himself, didn't offer excuses. He simply absorbed the poison she needed to expel, standing there like a penitent accepting his deserved punishment. Willa watched the scene with a broken heart, seeing pain on both sides of this impossible equation. Finally, when Cora ran out of words and collapsed against her pillows, exhausted by the emotional outburst, Willa approached gently. "You're right," she said simply, her voice calm but clear. "To be furious, to feel you were abandoned, and nothing we say can erase 15 years of absence." Cora looked at her with mixed surprise and suspicion. "And who are you? The new wife? Did you come to defend your rich husband?" "I'm Willa," she responded, sitting in the chair by the bed without asking permission. "And no, I didn't come to defend anyone. I came because I believe everyone in this room is trying to navigate situations we didn't ask for, and maybe doing it together is less painful than doing it alone." The girl frowned, clearly thrown off by this honest response instead of usual adult platitudes. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Willa smiled slightly. "It's recognition. That life is complicated, that adults make terrible mistakes, and that you have every right to be furious. But you also deserve help to get better. And if your biological father can help with that, isn't it worth trying?" The following days were delicate as crystal. Bone marrow compatibility tests took weeks to process completely, so all they could do was wait. Sterling visited the hospital daily, often finding Cora's door literally closed in his face. The girl wasn't ready to forgive, and he didn't pressure her. It was Willa who gradually built the first fragile bridge. She didn't try to act as mother or friend. Instead, she simply showed up, sat in the hospital room with her portable keyboard she had bought specifically for this, and played soft music. Not just classical pieces, but also folk melodies that her grandmother used to hum in Finger Lakes, American melodies that contained both pain and beauty. She didn't talk much during these sessions, just created a space of calm amid the medical chaos. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, Cora began to open up. First were questions about music, then about the vineyards where Willa grew up, and eventually, with enormous caution, about the father she was slowly learning to know. "Is he really rich?" she asked one afternoon, while Willa played a particularly melancholic melody. "Like rich?" Willa smiled without stopping playing. "Yes, he has a lot of money. More than I can honestly conceptualize." "Then why did my mom and I live in a small apartment in West Philadelphia while he probably had mansions?" "Because he didn't know you existed," Willa responded honestly. "And I know that doesn't make it less painful for you, but it's the truth. Your mother made a decision, for reasons only she fully knows, not to tell him. I'm not saying it was the right or wrong decision, just that it was the decision she made." Cora processed this in silence. "Do you love him?" she asked abruptly, changing subjects in a way only teenagers can. Willa stopped playing, considering the question carefully. "I'm learning to love him," she responded finally. "Our marriage started as an arrangement, a transaction to help my family. But over time, yes, I think I'm falling in love with him. With the person he is beneath all his defenses and fear. And doesn't it bother you that he has a secret daughter? the girl pressed, her grey eyes as penetrating as her father's. It surprised me, Willa admitted, and scared me because it meant our fragile marriage faced another enormous complexity. But no, it doesn't bother me that you exist. If anything, it helps me understand him better. To understand how pain can make people close themselves off, how fear of abandonment can become self-fulfilling prophecy. That conversation marked a turning point. Cora didn't forgive Sterling overnight. The wound of 15 years wouldn't heal with a few weeks of hospital visits. But she began to allow him to be present, to sit by her bed during painful procedures, to listen to his clumsy attempts to explain his own painful childhood that had made him the emotionally closed man he was. And when the compatibility results finally arrived, showing that Sterling was a perfectly compatible donor, something changed in Cora's eyes. It wasn't exactly gratitude, but an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, complex people can make terrible mistakes and still desperately try to do better. The transplant was scheduled for 6 weeks later at New York Presbyterian Hospital, considered the best in America for this type of complex procedures. The weeks of preparation were a whirlwind of medical consultations, tests, and the delicate emotional dance of 3 people trying to become something resembling a family. Vivian, the ex-wife, was inevitable in this process. Her first meeting with Sterling in 16 years occurred in a doctor's office, with Willa present at Sterling's insistence. It was tense and painful, full of silent accusations and resentments that time hadn't sweetened. "You should have told me," Sterling said finally, his voice controlled but vibrating with deep pain. "Regardless of what happened between us, I deserved to know I had a daughter." Vivian, an elegant woman who retained the aristocratic bearing of her Philadelphia upbringing, looked at him with hard eyes. "And what would you have done, Sterling? Sent us a monthly check while you continued building your empire? Would you have left your ambitions to change diapers and walk with a crying baby at 3 in the morning? You didn't give me the chance to choose," he exploded, his control breaking. "You made that decision for me, for Cora, for all of us." "Yes, I did," she responded, her voice cold as ice. "Because I knew you, Sterling. I knew the man who measured everything in terms of professional success, who couldn't separate his identity from his wealth. I didn't want my daughter growing up feeling like a burden or an obligation. Sometimes wrong decisions are made with intentions that seemed right at the time." Willa observed this painful exchange, seeing both sides of a tragedy where there were no clear villains, only wounded people making defensive decisions that multiplied pain. Finally, she intervened gently. "What happened 15 years ago we can't change," she said firmly. "But what we do now, in this moment, will determine what kind of future we build. Cora needs this transplant. She needs the 3 adults in her life to act like adults and not like adversaries." Vivian looked at her with surprise, as if only now registering her presence. "And who are you to have an opinion on family matters?" "I'm Sterling's wife," Willa responded without apologizing, "and someone who genuinely cares about Cora's well-being. Not because I have to, but because I want to." The day of the transplant dawned clear and cold in New York. Sterling was taken to surgery first for the marrow extraction, a procedure that, although routine, carried significant risks and pain. Willa waited in the waiting room, alone because Vivian was with Cora preparing for her part of the procedure. The hours dragged like centuries. Willa tried to read, tried to listen to music, but nothing could calm the anxiety that coiled in her stomach like a living snake. She thought about the last months, about how her life had been completely transformed since that night at the Fairmont in San Francisco. She had come to this marriage as a sacrifice, a transaction to save her family. But in the process, she had found something she wasn't looking for. A purpose beyond her own survival, a connection that transcended the contractual terms executed by Manhattan lawyers. She had fallen in love, slowly and then suddenly, with a complex and damaged man who was learning, with painful difficulty, how to be human again. And now he was in surgery, literally giving part of himself to save a daughter he barely knew, and she realized with surprising clarity she would do anything to protect him, to help him heal, to defend this fragile thing they had built together. When they finally brought him back to the recovery room, pale and obviously in pain, his eyes searched for hers immediately. "Cora," he asked, his voice hoarse from anesthesia. "The transplant went well," Willa reassured him, taking his hand carefully to avoid the IVs. The doctors are optimistic. Now we just have to wait for her body to accept the marrow. He closed his eyes, tears escaping from the corners. I'm so scared, he whispered, of losing her now that I've barely found her, that she'll hate me forever, that all this pain will be useless. Willa squeezed his hand. Fear means you care. It means you're really present and alive. And that's something beautiful, Sterling, even when it hurts. The following days were exhausting. Both Sterling and Cora faced expected but still distressing complications: infections, initial partial rejection, medication adjustments that caused severe side effects. Willa became bridge and mediator, emotional translator between three people who shared DNA but not shared history. Vivienne gradually began to soften toward her. One night, finding themselves in the hospital cafeteria at 3 a.m, both too anxious to sleep, the Philadelphia woman spoke with unexpected honesty. I made mistakes, she admitted, stirring her coffee with mechanical movements. Big mistakes. I thought I was protecting Cora, but I was actually protecting myself, from having to share her, from risking that he would be a better father than I believed possible. Willa listened without judging. We all make mistakes when we're afraid. What's important is what we do when we finally see clearly. Do you love him? Vivienne asked, echoing the question her own daughter had asked weeks before. Yes, Willa responded without hesitation this time. Not the way I imagined when I was a girl in Finger Lakes dreaming of romance. I love him with all his flaws and complicated past. I love him precisely because he's trying so desperately to be better. Vivienne nodded slowly. Take care of him, she said finally, words that clearly cost to say. And more importantly, help him take care of Cora. She needs him, even if she doesn't know it yet. Cora's recovery was slow but steady. Weeks turned into months of close medical monitoring, celebrating each positive marker in her blood tests, holding breath during each evaluation that determined whether her body was definitively accepting the transplant. During this period, something unexpected happened. They became family, not in the traditional, polished way seen in holiday photographs, but in the real, complicated way of people who survived something difficult together. Sterling learned patience sitting by the hospital bed, holding Cora's hand during painful procedures, listening to her stories about growing up in Philadelphia with a working mother who did everything possible with limited resources. Gradually, he began to understand the scope of what he had lost. 15 years of first words and lost teeth, of school festivals and ballet lessons, of all the small everyday magics that build a father-daughter relationship. Willa discovered maternal strength she didn't know she possessed. She became Cora's fierce advocate when doctors were insensitive, or American hospital bureaucracy became labyrinthine. She learned to translate complex medical jargon into language a scared teenager could understand, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cora began to reach out to her in ways she never did with her father or even her mother. Can I ask you something? Cora said one afternoon, while Willa arranged fresh flowers in her room, a routine she had adopted to bring some life and color to the clinical environment. Always, Willa responded, arranging white lilies in a vase. Why do you care so much? I mean, you don't have to be here. I'm not your daughter, and all this it's complicated and ugly. You could have just stayed in your pretty house in Big Sur and pretended none of this exists. Willa left the flowers and sat in the chair by the bed. You know what I learned in the last months? She asked, her eyes reflective. I learned that family isn't just about blood or legal contracts. It's about who shows up when things get difficult. It's about choosing to stay even when it would be easier to leave. And you choose to stay? Cora asked, her voice small, vulnerable in ways she rarely allowed. Every day, Willa confirmed. I choose to stay with your father while he learns to tear down his walls. I choose to stay with you while you fight to recover. Not because it's easy or simple, but because you two are the bravest people I know, and it would be a privilege to be part of your lives. The strongest family isn't the one that never breaks, but the one that rebuilds itself with more truth each time. 6 months after the transplant, doctors finally declared that Cora was in complete remission. Her body had accepted Sterling's marrow spectacularly, and although she would face years of medical monitoring, the prognosis was excellent. The celebration was quiet but deeply emotional. In the hospital room where they had spent so many anguished days, the 4 adults gathered: Sterling, Willa, Vivienne, and Cora, who was technically still a minor but had matured decades in those months. "I want to say something," Cora announced, sitting in her bed with more color in her cheeks than she'd had in a year. "To all of you." The room fell silent, everyone focusing on the girl who had been the center of so much pain and healing. "Dad," she began, and the use of that word made Sterling choke back a sob. "I'm still angry at you for the lost years, and I'll probably be angry for a long time, but I'm also grateful for showing up when it mattered, for giving part of yourself to save me, for trying." She turned to Vivian. "Mom, you made mistakes, but you also did everything possible with what you had, and I love you for that." Finally, she looked at Willa. "And you, I don't have words for you. You didn't have to do any of this, but you chose to stay. You chose to care for me, defend me, and you never tried to replace my mom or pretend our situation was something it wasn't. You're like the bridge we all needed to reach each other." Tears flowed freely in the room. They weren't tears of sadness, but of release, of complex gratitude that recognized both the pain and the beauty of what they had built together. When Cora was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later, she didn't return to Philadelphia with Vivian. Instead, through an arrangement carefully negotiated between the 3 adults, she would split time between both homes, part of the school year in Philadelphia with her mother, summers and holidays in California with Sterling and Willa. Cora's first summer at the Big Sur house was revealing. The girl, still physically weak but mentally stronger, explored the gardens that Willa had come to love, sat at the viewpoint, listening to the ocean that had consoled her stepmother during months of loneliness, and gradually began to know her father not as the myth or monster she had imagined, but as a complex human, trying to do better. One afternoon, the 3 of them went to Finger Lakes to visit Willa's family. Cora saw the vineyards her father had helped revitalize, walked among the vines that now produced exceptional quality grapes, and met Emerson, who treated her with the same reserved warmth he showed everyone he considered family. "Your father is a good man," the older vintner told Cora, as he showed her the cellars, the earthy smell of aging wine filling the air. "He made mistakes, like all of us, but when he decided to change, he did it with his whole heart. That's what matters." Those words, coming from a man who valued action over empty promises, meant more to Cora than any elaborate speech could have achieved. Sterling's transformation wasn't limited to his family life. His approach to business also began to change in subtle but significant ways. The months spent focusing on Cora's health, navigating the complex emotional landscape of his reconstituted family, had taught him something no MBA program could: that true success is measured in human connections, not in figures on financial statements. He began to restructure his corporate empire with different priorities. He initiated mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs from rural regions of America, like Finger Lakes. Now understanding the value of small communities he had ignored in his pursuit of urban conquests in New York and San Francisco, he invested in sustainable tourism projects that benefited local populations instead of just displacing communities for luxury developments. His corporate partners were confused. "It's not financially logical," argued one of his new financial directors during a meeting on Fifth Avenue. "These social projects will reduce profit margins in the short term." "Maybe," Sterling responded, with Willa sitting beside him in the boardroom, her silent presence giving him courage. "But they build something that will last longer than any fiscal quarter, real legacy, genuine contribution. And surprisingly, that matters more to me now than being the richest man in the cemetery. True power isn't in conquering, but in elevating others as you rise." Willa, for her part, had found her own place in this world that initially intimidated her so much. She didn't try to become a corporate executive or pretend expertise she didn't have. Instead, she established a foundation focused on music education for children from working families in rural regions of America. "Music saved me during my loneliest months in this house," she explained, during the foundation's launch at an event at Carnegie Hall. "It connected me with something bigger than my own uncertainty. I want to give that same opportunity to other children who might feel lost or invisible." The project grew beyond her most ambitious expectations. Schools in Appalachia, the Deep South, and the Great Plains requested participation. Private donors, inspired by her story of transformation from arranged bride to passionate philanthropist, contributed generously. During a particularly successful gala in New York, as she watched children from a small town in West Virginia perform a piece she herself had composed, Willa felt something she hadn't experienced in years, pure pride in something she had created, independent of her marriage to Sterling or the circumstances that brought her to this world. "You're extraordinary," Sterling whispered beside her, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. "You know that, don't you?" She smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "I'm learning to believe it, just like you're learning that you're more than your wealth." Their first wedding anniversary was approaching, and they decided to celebrate it meaningfully, returning to the Fairmont in San Francisco where it all began. But this time, circumstances were radically different. Cora accompanied them, healthy and vibrant, with Vivienne blessing the trip as an important step in building this unconventional family. Willa's parents traveled from Finger Lakes, Emerson now able to hold wine glasses from his own revitalized harvest without tremors, his health restored along with his dignity. On the anniversary night, Sterling and Willa found themselves again in the presidential suite. 1 year had passed, but it could have been a lifetime of transformation. "Do you remember what you asked me that first night?" he asked, taking her hands as the golden San Francisco light came through the windows. "I asked you to be gentle," she responded, smiling at the memory of that terrified young woman who could barely speak. "I thought I understood what it meant," he admitted. "But you were asking me for something much deeper. You were asking me to be human, to lower the defenses and allow someone to truly see me. And did you?" she asked softly, though she knew the answer. "I tried. I keep trying every day," he responded. "And in the process, I discovered that true courage isn't in conquering markets or accumulating wealth. It's in allowing yourself to be vulnerable, in risking being hurt for genuine love. But even happy endings require final tests." 6 months after their anniversary, they faced a challenge that threatened everything they had built together. A journalistic investigation by an ambitious reporter from New York began unearthing details from Sterling's corporate past. It found no illegalities, but ethically questionable business practices from his early years, displacements of small communities for developments in Manhattan, aggressive negotiation tactics that had ruined smaller competitors, the type of ruthless behavior that had made him successful, but not admirable. The article, published in a national newspaper, was devastating in its precision. It didn't defame or lie, it simply presented facts Sterling couldn't deny. The man he had built had been, in many ways, the type of corporate predator who destroyed exactly the kind of communities he now tried to help. The public response was swift and brutal. Corporate partners distanced themselves. The social programs he had initiated faced scrutiny and accusations of calculated image laundering. Even Willa's foundation faced criticism for being funded by dirty money. For 2 weeks, the media scandal grew. Reporters camped outside the Big Sur house. Every movement was photographed, every statement analyzed, looking for hypocrisy or falsehood. Willa found Sterling one night in his office, looking at public relations reports with a defeated expression. "Maybe we should divorce," he said without looking at her, "to protect your foundation, your reputation. Here it's not fair for you to pay for my past mistakes. True love doesn't flee when things get difficult, it roots more deeply." She approached and closed his laptop with a decisive movement. "Do you remember what I told Cora in the hospital?" she asked, her voice firm. "That family is about who shows up when things get difficult. Well, this is difficult, and I'm showing up. But your foundation," he began weakly. "Will survive or not on its own merits," she interrupted. "But I'm not going to abandon you now. Not because I'm trapped in a contract, but because I love you. With your imperfect past and complicated present, I love you precisely because you're trying to be better, even knowing that the path to redemption is long and full of people who won't believe in your sincerity." He looked at her with tears in his eyes. "I don't deserve it. I don't deserve your loyalty or your love." "Probably not," she smiled slightly. "But love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing, and I choose you every day with full awareness of who you were and who you're trying to be." They decided to face the crisis head-on. Instead of hiding or hiring expensive public relations firms to manage the message, Sterling gave a completely honest press conference. No evasions, no justifications, just direct acknowledgement of his past. "Everything you've read is true," he said before the cameras, his voice trembling but clear. "I was ruthless in my youth. I displaced communities, ruined competitors, measured success solely in terms of wealth acquisition. I can't change those actions, and I won't insult the victims of my past decisions by pretending they didn't happen. He paused, searching for Willa in the crowd. She nodded with silent encouragement. But I can tell you this, I've spent the last year learning that living only to accumulate wealth is slowly dying from the inside. My wife, my daughter, my extended family have taught me that true legacy isn't in buildings or bank accounts. It's in lives positively touched, in communities elevated, in honesty about our failures, and genuine commitment to doing better. The social projects I've initiated don't erase my past, he continued. Nothing can do that, but they represent a genuine commitment to spending the rest of my life trying to contribute more than I take, to build more than I destroy. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm only asking that you judge my transformation not by my words, but by my sustained actions in the years to come. The response was mixed. Some praised him for his honesty, others remained skeptical, seeing it as a calculated public relations maneuver. But what mattered was that he had spoken his truth, without hiding behind corporate spokespeople or careful legal language. In the following weeks, something unexpected happened. People who had been affected by his past business practices began contacting him. Some sought compensation, others simply wanted him to acknowledge the harm caused. Sterling met with everyone who wanted to talk, listening to stories of ruined family businesses, displaced communities, the real human cost of his unbridled ambition. It was painful and humiliating, but also healing. Willa was by his side during every meeting, witnessing both his pain and his genuine commitment to make amends where possible. They established a compensation fund for displaced communities, not by legal requirement, but by moral imperative. He invested in revitalization programs for areas his past developments had damaged. It wasn't enough, it would never be completely enough to erase past harm, but it was something. It was genuine, sincere attempt at real transformation. 2 years after that first night in San Francisco, the reunited family found themselves on the revitalized lands of Finger Lakes to celebrate the first harvest of the new Riesling variety that agricultural specialists had developed specifically for the unique conditions of Ashford soil. It was a perfect autumn day in upstate New York. The sun gilded the rolling hills covered with vines laden with pale green grapes. The aroma of fertile earth and ripe fruit filled the air, mixed with the sound of laughter and folk music floating from the restored family winery. Willa walked among the vine rows, her fingers brushing the dark green leaves, feeling the visceral connection with this land that had formed her. Beside her, Sterling observed with an expression of silent wonder, a man accustomed to glass towers and financial centers, now completely captivated by the simple beauty of well-executed agriculture. "It's beautiful," he said softly, taking her hand. "All of this, what your family built, what we helped restore. It feels real?" she completed, smiling. "Yes, real in ways none of my commercial developments ever felt. This will endure. These vines will be here in 100 years, producing wine, feeding families. That's true legacy." Cora appeared running through the vines, now 17 years old, healthy and vibrant, her dark hair shining under the upstate sun. "Dad, Grandpa Emerson says you have to help with the press. He says it's time you learned to make wine with your own hands, not just buy the most expensive bottles at New York auctions." Sterling laughed, a sound that had been rare 2 years ago, but now flowed naturally. "Tell your grandfather I'll be there in a moment." Cora nodded but didn't leave immediately. Instead, she looked at both of them with those penetrating grey eyes she had inherited from her father. "You know what?" she said thoughtfully. "When I was sick, I used to think that if I survived, I'd just want a normal family. Like in the movies, you know. But now I realize that this—" She gestured, encompassing the vines, the winery, the two families blending harmoniously. "This is better than normal. It's real and honest. And we actively chose it instead of just accepting what we were given." She kissed both on the cheek and ran back toward the winery, leaving Willa and Sterling standing among the vines, processing the unexpected wisdom of a teenager who had matured through pain. "She's right," Willa murmured. "We chose this. Every day we choose to stay, choose to work on it, choose to believe that imperfect people can build something beautiful together." Sterling drew her to him, his embrace firm but gentle. That first night in San Francisco, when you asked me to be gentle, you were giving me a gift I didn't comprehend in that moment. You were showing me that there was another way to live, another way to be, not as conqueror or emperor, but as simply human, vulnerable, open, real. And do you regret it? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Every day I bring my fears to the new day, he responded honestly. Fear of not being good enough, of disappointing you, that my past will contaminate our future. But no, I don't regret it, because I'm finally living instead of just existing. I'm finally feeling things deeper than satisfaction over a well-executed deal. True love isn't the absence of fear, but the courage to choose connection despite the fear. That afternoon, during the harvest celebration, Emerson brought out the first bottle of the new wine. It wasn't ready to drink yet, would require years of aging to reach its full potential, but the first sample showed exceptional promise. This wine, the older vintner announced, his voice loaded with emotion, holding the bottle like it was a newborn grandchild, represents more than grapes and earth. It represents resilience. It represents community. It represents that even when it seems everything is lost, with proper care and patience, life can flourish again. He looked directly at Sterling, and it represents that people can change. That past mistakes don't have to define the future, as long as the regret is genuine and the commitment to do better is real. Sterling, visibly moved, raised his glass. To new harvests and to second chances. To the families we choose, Vivian added, surprisingly present and comfortable between her ex-husband and his new wife. To the honesty that hurts but heals, Cora contributed. To loves that grow slowly, like well-tended vines, Willa finished, her eyes finding Sterling's across the gathered circle. With deep roots that can withstand storms because they were planted in truth, not convenience. They drank together, the young wine harsh but promising like all things worth cultivating. And as the sun set over the hills of Finger Lakes, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that rivaled any California sunset, Willa and Sterling stood together, their hands intertwined, contemplating a future they had built brick by brick, choice by choice, truth by truth. The promise of that first night in San Francisco had transformed into something neither had anticipated. Not a perfect fairy tale ending, but something more valuable, a real, authentic beginning of complex and imperfect people committing each day to be better together than they could be alone. The white dress Willa had worn that nervous night was now stored in a closet in Big Sur, a reminder of the scared young woman who had asked for gentleness and received a transformation. In its place, she wore simple upstate farm clothes with dirt under her nails and satisfaction in her heart, finally completely herself in all her complexities. And Sterling, the tycoon who had measured his worth in corporate conquests, now found his greatest pride not in the New York Stock Exchange Index, but in the embrace of a daughter who had learned to forgive, in the respect of an upstate father-in-law who valued character over net worth, and in the love of a woman who had chosen to see him not as a redemption project, but as a partner in the shared journey toward becoming more authentic versions of themselves. The empire still existed. The glass towers in New York and San Francisco still rose against the American sky, but they no longer defined him. It was simply what he did, not what he was. And that distinction, learned painfully through crises and revelations, marked all the difference between existing and truly living. As stars began to appear over Finger Lakes, as they had appeared over these lands for countless generations, and would appear for future generations, two people who had begun as strangers, united by necessity, stood together as chosen partners, committed lovers, mutual witnesses to the difficult and rewarding work of genuine transformation. And if someone had asked them the secret of their unexpected success, they might have pointed to the vines surrounding them. Real growth requires time, patience, proper conditions, and constant care. It requires being pruned at painful moments, requires facing storms without guarantee of survival, requires faith in processes that cannot be rushed. But most of all, it requires being rooted in truth, watered with honesty, and cultivated with the humble understanding that the most valuable things rarely come easily, but precisely because of that, are worth every moment of effort invested. Because in the end, true love isn't found, it's built, cultivated, chosen daily, with the same dedication a vintner dedicates to their most precious vines.